The black Chevrolet Tahoe pulled up outside the gates of the old lumber mill. Rain had been drumming on the roof for 3 straight hours, and something about that sound set Ethan Carter's teeth on edge, the same way rain had hammered the roof of a prison block 20 years ago, on the night his life fell apart. He didn't get out of the car right away. He sat there, staring through the wet glass at the rusted sign that read Bell & Sons, at the peeling paint, at the way that once proud building was sinking under its own weight, just like the man who'd built it. "Mr. Carter, they're waiting for you," the driver said. "I know," he answered quietly. "Give me another minute." He pulled a worn black and white photograph from the inside pocket of his coat. In it, a young man of about 20 with a weathered face, wearing a grease-stained work jacket, stood next to a girl with a mop of light brown hair, laughing like there was nothing in the world but that one perfect day. On the back, in faded ink, Emma and Ethan. Summer. We're going to be happy. He hadn't been happy a single day in the last 20 years, until now, because today he understood everything was going to change. He hadn't come here for revenge, even though as recently as yesterday he'd been sure that was exactly why he'd come. He had no idea that within the hour he'd learn a truth that would tear apart everything he'd built his new life on. He didn't know that the man he despised more than anyone else on earth was about to say words that would split his world into before and after for the second time. But let's start from the beginning. Ethan was born in a small town called Cedar Falls, Washington, wedged between forest and river, a place that ran on exactly 3 things: the Bell family lumber mill, the bus stop downtown, and gossip that traveled faster than any car could drive through it. His father, Robert Carter, was a carpenter, golden hands, a hard temperament. The workshop behind their house smelled of fresh sawdust and varnish, and young Ethan spent more time there than he ever did at school. His mother, Linda, worked as a nurse at the local clinic and always came home exhausted, but always with a smile saved just for her son. "Our Ethan's going to grow up and build a better house than the Bells ever could," his father used to say, ruffling the boy's hair. "With his own 2 hands. No handouts, no dirty money." The Bells were about as close to local royalty as Cedar Falls had. Richard Bell owned the mill that half the town's economy depended on, the columned house at the edge of town, and a reputation as a man you didn't want to cross. He had one son, Ryan, the same age as Ethan, and the 2 of them had been friends since 1st grade. The friendship started by accident. On the schoolyard, some local kids were beating up a skinny boy in an expensive jacket for thinking he's better than everybody. 10-year-old Ethan threw himself into the fight to defend him, even though the odds were clearly against him. Both boys got roughed up, but from that day on, Ryan Bell followed Ethan Carter around like a shadow. "You're the first person who ever stood up for me who wasn't scared of my dad," Ryan said back then, wiping a split lip with his sleeve. "Thanks." "Forget it," Ethan shrugged. "It's just not right, 3 against 1. Neither of them had any idea that 15 years later, Ryan himself would become that very 3 against 1, only far more sophisticated than a couple of schoolyard bullies. They grew up together, fished the river, played pickup football behind the school bus lot, skipped shop class together because Ethan already knew more woodworking than the teacher did. Ryan, for all his family's money, genuinely envied that, not the money, but the ease with which Ethan mastered things that took patience and character. "You know, I'd give anything to be able to do what you do," Ryan admitted once, watching Ethan turn a chair leg on the lathe in his father's shop. "My dad says only guys who don't have the brains for anything better work with their hands." "And what do you think?" Ethan asked, not looking up from his work. "I think my dad doesn't understand a lot of things," Ryan said quietly. At the time, it sounded like ordinary teenage honesty. Only years later would Ethan understand that Ryan had never stopped wanting what Ethan had. Not the skill, no. He wanted the warmth that filled that little house, the respect in the way Ethan's father talked to his son, the freedom to simply be himself instead of an heir to a family name. Envy rarely announces itself right away. More often, it collects quietly, for years, until one day it finds a reason to break loose, and when it does, it takes everything with it. But the people in this story wouldn't learn that until it was far too late. When Ethan was 16, the Hayes family moved to Cedar Falls. The father took a foreman's job at the Bell Mill, and the daughter, Emma, landed in the class next door, a quiet, watchful girl with attentive gray eyes who won over half the school within a month simply by knowing how to listen instead of just talk. Ethan didn't fall for her right away. First, there was ordinary interest. He carried her bag home after her bike chain broke. They got to talking, and it turned out they both loved grim war novels and couldn't stand oatmeal. Then it grew into something bigger, into those evenings down by the river where silence said more than words ever could. "You know what scares me most?" Emma asked him once, watching the sun go down over the water. "What?" "That one day I'll realize this whole quiet, peaceful life was just the calm before a storm." Ethan laughed then and wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "No storms while I'm around. I promise." He would have kept that promise if the world around him hadn't started collapsing so fast that he wouldn't have been able to keep it even if he'd given his entire life trying. Ryan wasn't indifferent to Emma either. He just never admitted it to anyone but the mirror at night. He watched Ethan and Emma hold hands at school dances, watched how effortlessly conversation flowed between them, and every time, something inside him twisted. "Why does he get everything, and all I get is my father's money?" he thought, watching them from across the schoolyard. He didn't know yet that he'd soon get a chance to fix that, and that the chance would turn him into a man he'd hate himself for becoming years down the line. Meanwhile, things at his father's workshop kept getting worse. Robert Carter took private commissions, furniture, windows, staircases for the wealthier houses in town. But once a big furniture chain moved in, the orders started drying up. Richard Bell, as it happened, was one of the silent partners behind that very chain, having bought in through a shell company that almost nobody in Cedar Falls knew about. "Don't worry, Rob," Linda would tell her husband in the evenings, when he sat hunched over the ledger for hours, rubbing his temples. "We'll get through it. We always have." "We'll get through it," Robert echoed, but his voice had lost its old certainty. Ethan watched his father change, grow quieter, harder, cut himself off mid-sentence more and more. One night he found him in the workshop late, sitting on a stool with his head in his hands, a stack of unpaid bills on the workbench beside him. "Dad, I can help. I'll quit school, get a job." "Absolutely not," Robert snapped, lifting his head. "You're going to finish school, go to college, and become an engineer, just like you always dreamed. Do you hear me?" "I didn't break my back at this bench for 20 years so my son could end up living my life instead of his own." He had no idea that the fate waiting for his son would turn out to be far worse. When Richard Bell heard about the Carters' money troubles, he offered Robert a favor, a loan at a friendly rate, arranged through an intermediary so as not to bother the bank with a bunch of paperwork. Robert, pushed to the edge, signed without reading every line of the contract that Bell's smiling lawyer brought over for his signature. "Just a formality, Mr. Carter," the lawyer assured him. "Mr. Bell wants to help out, neighbor to neighbor. He remembers you from back when you were young, before I was even born." Robert signed. And with that stroke of the pen, he signed away his entire family's future, though he wouldn't understand that for another 2 years, by which point it was far too late to undo it. The Carters had no idea that the contract had been written so cleverly that the workshop, the house, and everything Robert owned had become collateral Bell could seize on some technicality whenever he chose. And that moment came far sooner than anyone could have imagined. Ethan was 18 when everything fell apart. It was late autumn. He was studying for his final exams, dreaming of a college in Seattle, and walking Emma home every evening, sketching out plans for a future that had room for the two of them, decades into it. That day, he came home from school to find a strange car outside the house, a black Ford Explorer, polished to a shine, with the lumber company's logo on the door. Inside sat 2 men in suits, and his mother, pale as a sheet, twisting some papers in her hands. "What happened?" Ethan asked from the doorway. "Your father didn't meet the terms of the loan," one of the men said flatly, not even glancing at him. "The account's more than 90 days past due."
Per Section 7, the collateral property reverts to the lender.
"That's not possible,"
Linda whispered.
"We paid every month. We have every receipt."
"Our records say otherwise," the man said, holding out a folder of documents. "No payments have come in for 4 months. Ethan snatched the folder out of his hands and flipped through the pages. Something was wrong. The amounts, the dates, the signatures. Like they'd been filled in by a different hand. But who was going to listen to an 18-year-old kid arguing against lawyers and notarized stamps? "Where's Dad?" he asked, feeling the ground give way beneath him. His mother didn't answer. She just cried, quietly. That evening, Robert Carter drove out to the mill to demand an explanation from Bell himself. What happened behind the closed door of that office, nobody knows for sure. All anyone knows is that he came home a different man, hunched over, hollowed out, like the air had been sucked clean out of him.
"He laughed in my face," was all Robert told his wife that night, not knowing his son could hear every word through the thin wall. "Said business is business, and I shouldn't have signed something without reading it. Said the workshop, the house, all of it's his now, legally." "Rob, we can fight this in court." "With what money, Linda? What money do we use to hire a lawyer against a man who owns half this town?" A month later, the Carter family officially lost their home. 2 months after that, they lost the workshop, where Robert had worked for more than 20 years. Ethan remembered the last time his father locked the workshop door from the outside, how his hands shook, and not from the cold. "We'll get back on our feet, son," he said quietly, looking at Ethan with hollow eyes. "People have come back from worse." But fate had other plans. 6 months later, Robert Carter died of a heart attack, never having recovered from the blow, not the illness itself, but the betrayal of a man he had once called a neighbor. Ethan was 19. He was now the only man left in a family with no home, no money, and no hope. He didn't know then that his father's death was only the first price he'd have to pay, that the real betrayal was still ahead of him, and it wouldn't come from a stranger with a legal folder. It would come from the person he called his best friend. Ryan Bell came to Robert Carter's funeral, stood off to one side in an expensive black coat, not sure he had the nerve to approach. After the service, he finally found the courage to walk up to Ethan. "Ethan, I'm so sorry. I told my dad this was wrong, but your father killed mine." Ethan cut him off flatly. "And you came here to apologize?" "I didn't know he'd go that far. I swear to you." Ethan looked at him for a long, heavy moment. "You know what's the worst part, Ryan? I believe you. I really do think you didn't know, but you didn't lift a finger to stop it either, and you could have." Ryan had no answer for that. He turned and walked away, and in that moment, a crack opened between the two friends that would eventually become a canyon. Years later, he would regret not telling the truth right then. Not the pathetic half-truth of an apology, but the real one. That he, himself, behind his father's back, had already started plotting how to take from Ethan the one thing he had left. After his father's death, Ethan took a job at the very same Bell Mill. There was nowhere else to go, and his mother and little sister Chloe needed to eat. He swallowed his pride and showed up for his shift, trying not to think about whose name was stamped over the front gate. He worked hard, fast, precise, with the same care his father had always brought to a job. Within 6 months, he'd been made a shift lead, which turned out to needle old man Bell in a way he hadn't expected. The son of the man he'd ruined was becoming a respected man in town all over again. Ryan, meanwhile, kept trying to patch things up, stopping by the shop floor, inviting Ethan out for a drink, and every time running into the same cold politeness. "Ethan, come on, how long is this going to go on? I said I was sorry." "Sorry doesn't get the house back, Ryan. It doesn't bring my father back either." Around that time, Emma started a teaching program at a college in Seattle, but she came home to Cedar Falls every single weekend, to see her mother and to see Ethan. If anything, their relationship only grew stronger through the grief, as if it had welded them together tighter than any vow could have. "We'll get married the second I finish school," Ethan told her, holding her at the bus stop before she left. "We'll get out of here. Start over, just the two of us."
"I'll wait," she answered, pressing into his shoulder. "As long as it takes." She had no idea the wait wouldn't be measured in months, or even years. It would be measured in an entire life, one that was about to be stolen from both of them. Everything that happened next happened fast, like it had been planned, because it had been. One night, a fire broke out in the finished goods warehouse at the mill. Nearly half the lumber set aside for a major contract burned, a loss in the millions. Police found their culprit fast. Security footage showed a figure in Ethan's work jacket entering the warehouse shortly before the blaze started. "It wasn't me!" he shouted during questioning. "I wasn't even in town that night. I drove out to see my mother in Idaho. She'd had a heart scare." "We have a witness who says otherwise," the detective said, with a lazy sort of indifference.
The witness turned out to be the warehouse's night guard, a man Richard Bell himself had hired just a month earlier. Ethan was arrested. The evidence had been arranged with impressive care. The camera footage, the guard's statement, even a lighter supposedly found at the scene with Ethan's fingerprints on it. He really had used it once, lighting a cigarette for a coworker, and thought nothing of it. And the court didn't give him a chance. "I'm innocent," he repeated at every hearing, looking the judge in the eye. "I have no motive to burn down the place where I work." "You have every motive," the district attorney countered. "Hatred toward the Bell family, losing your home, your father's death. That's more than enough motive for revenge." Nobody stopped to ask how the prosecution had come up with a motive stated so conveniently. Nobody noticed that the camera footage had been doctored, that the frame supposedly showing his face was actually too dark to make out any features, and that a jacket that merely resembled his had become the star piece of evidence. Ethan was sentenced to 7 years in a state medium-security prison for arson, causing major property damage. In the courtroom, he searched for only one face, Emma's. She sat in the back row, white as chalk, her hands shaking, and when the sentence was read, she cried quietly. "I'll wait for you," she mouthed, as the guards led him out. He believed her. And that belief was the only thing that kept him afloat for the months that followed. The truth wouldn't come out until 20 years later, by which point nothing could be changed. For now, no one in that courtroom except 2 people knew that the real arsonist had never been Ethan Carter at all. Along with Emma, Ethan's mother had also been sitting in the courtroom, gaunt, her eyes dark with grief. She hadn't said a word through all 3 hearings, just gripped an old handkerchief her own mother had embroidered. "Your Honor," the court-appointed public defender said, flipping through the case file without much enthusiasm. "My client maintains his innocence. The security footage doesn't allow for a positive identification of the individual on camera." "The jacket seen on the recording belongs to the defendant," the prosecutor shot back. Young, ambitious, clearly hungry for a quick, high-profile win. "The defendant doesn't dispute that fact." "That jacket could have been stolen," Ethan burst out, rising from his seat. "I kept my work clothes in the shop locker. The whole crew had access to it." "Defendant, sit down," the judge said wearily. An older woman who, after years on the bench, had seen hundreds of scenes just like this one. "You'll have your chance to speak in your own defense." When it was his turn to speak, Ethan stood, and despite everything, his voice came out steady. "I know my father lost everything because of the Bell family. I know I have every reason to hate them. But I am not an arsonist. I was in Idaho that night, at my mother's bedside. The on-call doctor at the local hospital who examined her can confirm that." "That doctor," the prosecutor cut in, "is a longtime family friend of the Carters, and his testimony can hardly be considered objective." "And the guard my client hired a month before the fire, is his testimony objective?" Ethan asked bitterly. Silence fell over the room. The judge banged her gavel. "Questions for the court go through counsel, not the defendant directly. We'll continue." Listening to that exchange, Linda Carter buried her face in her hands. She knew the truth. She knew her son was innocent. But she also knew that in this town, truth had long since stopped mattering wherever the Bells' interests began. When the verdict came down, 7 years in a state medium-security facility, the courtroom gasped. A few family friends nodded along in approval, agreeing with the court's decision. Others simply looked away, guilty, unwilling to say out loud what they really thought, that this sentence had been bought, not earned. "Mom, don't cry," Ethan said, when they let him say a quick goodbye before he was taken away. "I can handle this. Take care of Chloe. And don't you dare give up, you hear me? I'll be back." "I'll wait for you every single day, son," Linda whispered, holding him one last time before the guard gently but firmly pulled them apart. "Every day." She kept that promise, but her heart, worn down by years of struggle and loss, couldn't hold out for the whole weight. Ethan survived that first year in prison on nothing but letters. Emma wrote every week, telling him about school, about her mother, about how she was counting down the days until his release. He read those letters over and over, until the paper wore thin at the folds. Meanwhile, his mother, Linda, was left alone with 12-year-old Chloe, no house, no husband, and now a son behind bars. She rented a room from a distant relative and worked 2 jobs, but there was barely enough money for groceries. And Richard Bell, having gotten what he wanted, turned his attention to a new way of tightening his grip on the town, marrying off his one and only heir. "Ryan, it's time you settled down," he told his son one night over dinner. "Emma's a sharp girl, quiet, well-raised, and her father's in my good graces." "Dad, Emma has a boyfriend," Ryan said quietly. "Emma has a boyfriend sitting in prison for arson, who's going to walk out of there, if he walks out at all, a broke ex-con with no roof over his head."
And you, Ryan, you have a future, a house, my life's work, which I'm going to hand to you. Think about what you can offer her and what I'm offering her." Ryan sat with that for a long while. He wasn't a cruel man by nature, just a weak one. That weakness had been quietly building for years under a mask of wealth and confidence, and when the moment came to choose between conscience and comfort, he chose comfort. He started courting Emma, politely, without pressure, always somehow just happening to be nearby whenever she needed help. He helped her father out at the mill, paid for her mother's medication, found 1,000 small excuses to make himself useful. "Ryan, I appreciate you looking out for us, but I have Ethan," Emma told him more than once. "I know," he'd answer gently. "I just want your family to be okay. It's not a crime to help out a friend." What he never told her was the real reason. Her father, David Hayes, owed the Bell Company a substantial sum, money Richard had loaned him under the guise of helping out when David's wife got sick. And that the moment Emma turned Ryan down, that debt could be called in immediately, along with her father's job and the roof over her family's head. Emma didn't find out about any of it until 2 years later, from a phone call she overheard by accident. "Dad, is it true? Do you owe him money?" she demanded that same night, bursting into his room. Her father lowered his head. "Sweetheart, I'm sorry. I didn't want you to know. I didn't want you feeling like you owed him anything." "Then why did you let Ryan treat me like this, knowing that?" "What was I supposed to do?" her father snapped. "Turn down help and watch your mother die without her medicine?" "I didn't have a choice, Emma. And honestly, pretty soon, you won't either." She had no idea that within a few months, Richard Bell would show up at their door in person, with an ultimatum you couldn't say no to. Richard Bell came to see the Hayes family himself, a rare gesture for a man like him, which meant this mattered. "David, you're like a son to me," he began, settling into an old armchair in their small living room. "So I'm going to say this plainly. The debt for the medication, for Emma's schooling, for your wife's surgery, it comes to almost $80,000. You don't have that kind of money, and you're never going to. But I have a proposal that solves everything, all at once." "What proposal?" David asked quietly, though it seemed he'd already guessed. "Emma marries Ryan. The debt is wiped clean. More than that, I'll make you assistant plant manager. Your family won't want for anything for the rest of your lives." "And if she says no?" Bell shrugged, but there wasn't a trace of kindness in his eyes. "Then I collect the debt through the courts. And believe me, in this town, the courts are always on my side. You'll lose the house, and your wife loses access to the treatment I hear she still needs." He didn't raise his voice, didn't threaten outright. He simply laid it all out like a business proposal. And that was exactly what made it so coldly cruel. Emma learned about that conversation that same evening. She sat on the porch for a long time, staring into the dark, and then wrote Ethan one last letter, the one that reached him behind bars 2 weeks later. "Ethan," it read, in shaking handwriting, "forgive me. I don't know how to explain what I'm about to do. Just know this. Whatever you hear about me after this, I never stopped loving you, and I never will. But I don't have a choice anymore. Don't wait for me. Please, don't wait." He read that letter by the dim light of his cell, over and over, until the words blurred in front of him, whether from tears or from helplessness he couldn't say.
He wrote back dozens of letters begging her to explain, to come see him, to say anything at all. There was no answer. 6 months later, word reached him through his mother, who'd heard it from a neighbor. Emma Hayes had married Ryan Bell. A big wedding, the whole town invited, the bride in white smiling in the photographs like she was happy. That night, his cellmates saw Ethan cry for the first time. He didn't make a sound, just sat with his face to the wall, shoulders shaking. "That's it, huh? All alone now?" his cellmate asked with something like sympathy, an older inmate everyone called the old-timer. "That's it," Ethan said flatly. "There's nothing left." "Then it's time to start over," the old-timer said, philosophical. "When you've got nothing left to lose, you've got nothing left to be afraid of either. Remember that, kid. One day you'll need it." Ethan didn't believe him back then, but those words, spoken in a filthy prison cell, would turn out to be prophetic and would shape the rest of his life. In his 4th year inside, Ethan received a message he would remember for the rest of his days. "Mom's in the hospital. Heart. Come if you can." Signed by Chloe, his little sister, barely 16 at the time. He filed for emergency furlough to visit a critically ill family member, a long, bureaucratic process that could take weeks. The warden, a decent enough man named Donovan, pushed the paperwork through faster than usual. But it was already too late. Linda Carter died 3 days before the furlough was approved. They called Ethan into the prison psychologist's office to break the news. He listened in silence, nodded, and walked out without saying a word. His cellmates, used to his composure, watched that night as he drove his fist into the concrete wall again and again, until his knuckles bled, until the old-timer physically pulled him away. "That's enough, kid. Hurting yourself won't make it hurt less." "She waited for me," Ethan kept repeating, hollow. "She promised she'd wait." "She did wait," the old-timer said quietly. "Right up to her last breath. Life just doesn't always ask whether we're ready or not." They didn't let him attend his mother's funeral. The timeline was too short, the paperwork too heavy. He said his goodbyes in his head, staring through the barred window at a scrap of gray sky, and it was, without question, the loneliest goodbye of his life. Chloe went to live with a distant aunt on their mother's side, over in neighboring Idaho, a woman without much money, but with a good heart, who found room in her home for a niece who'd suddenly lost everything. Ethan wrote his sister every week, trying to be some kind of anchor for her from a distance, even though he needed one himself just as badly. "Ethan, don't worry about me," Chloe wrote back, growing up faster than her years should have allowed. "Aunt Pam is great. I'm getting straight A's. I'm going to get into medical school just like I always wanted. You just hang in there. You and me, we're all we've got left. You don't get to give up." Those letters became the same lifeline for Ethan that Emma's letters had once been. Only this time, he knew for certain. This person would never betray him. He had no idea that years later, Chloe, by then an accomplished cardiac surgeon, would be standing right beside him at the most decisive moment of his life. But that was still far off. For now there was only a cold winter, 3.5 more years to serve, and a vow he made to himself at a grave he never got to see. Survive, get back up, and never again let someone else's cruelty decide his fate. Ethan left Washington the very day he walked out of prison. His record closed most doors before he even got to knock. No respectable mill wanted to hire the arsonist, no matter how many times he explained the conviction had been unjust. He scraped by on odd jobs, unloading trucks, laying tile, patching fences for pocket change. For the first few months, he slept on a cot in a cheap roadside motel for laborers, sharing a room with 4 other men just as lost as he was. The turning point came by accident. The owner of a small custom furniture shop, an old man named Wilson, watched Ethan fix a neighbor's wobbly chair and couldn't look away. "Where'd you learn hands like that, son?" he asked, studying joints so clean they looked machined. "My father taught me. He was a carpenter."
Was? He passed, Ethan said shortly. Wilson was quiet for a moment, then waved a hand. "Come by my shop tomorrow. I'll give you a shot. Not asking about your record. I care about your hands, not your paperwork." That was the turning point. Ethan worked like 3 men in one, took on the hardest jobs, stayed late at the shop, spent his nights studying whatever books he could get his hands on about woodworking, economics, management. 2 years in, Wilson, who had no children of his own, offered to make him a partner. "I'm getting old, Ethan. Who else would I leave this to?" 3 years after that, Ethan bought out the rest of his share. The old man decided to retire and move in with his daughter in another town.
The shop, once tiny, grew into a small furniture manufacturing operation, and eventually into a holding company that included woodworking plants, a logistics business, and, years later, an investment fund that bought up distressed manufacturing assets. He built his empire with the same care his father had once put into turning a single chair leg, piece by piece, without rushing, without cutting corners on his conscience. He never forgot the lesson his father's death had taught him. A business built on someone else's misery collapses on its own, sooner or later. He never married. He tried to build relationships. There were women, even an engagement, which he broke off himself, a month before the wedding, the moment he realized he couldn't forget a pair of gray eyes and laughter by a river. Part of his heart had stayed behind in Cedar Falls, stuck somewhere between prison and that last letter he kept in his jacket's inside pocket, no matter where he traveled.
He didn't let himself think about Emma too often. But sometimes, late at night, he'd take out that old photograph and study it for a long time, as if her eyes held the answer to the question that had haunted him all these years. Why? He didn't know yet that the answer would turn out to be far more complicated and far more tragic than he could have imagined. In 15 years away from Cedar Falls, Ethan made one serious attempt at building a new family. Her name was Megan, a lawyer who'd helped him structure his first major contracts, smart, strong, and genuinely in love with him. "You never talk about your past," she told him one evening, a month before their planned wedding, studying his thoughtful face over dinner. "I'm not asking for details, it's just, sometimes it feels like you're marrying me, but your heart's still living somewhere else." Ethan was quiet for a long moment, turning his glass in his hand. "I'm sorry, Megan. You deserve a man who can give you all of himself. And he shook his head. "I'm not sure I'm capable of that. There's someone I can't let go of, even after more than 10 years. Is she still alive? I don't know. I don't want to know. But until I find out, I don't have the right to build a life with you while lying to myself that I'm giving you 100%. Megan cried, but she didn't argue or beg him to reconsider. "Thank you for being honest," she finally said, wiping her eyes. "I just wish you'd figured that out 6 months ago instead of now. But I suppose better late than on our anniversary." They called off the wedding a month before the date. Megan married someone else the following year, and, from what he heard, was happy. Ethan threw himself into work, convincing himself that personal happiness simply wasn't in the cards for him, that his lot in life was to build a business, take care of his sister, and quietly carry, in his heart, the one love he could never manage to bury, no matter how hard he tried.
He had no idea that the question, "Is she still alive?" had a far more complicated answer than a simple yes or no. That somewhere far away, in a small town by a river, there lived not just Emma, but a piece of himself he never knew existed. 20 years passed. The Bell Empire, which had once controlled half of Cedar Falls' economy, slowly but surely fell apart. Richard Bell had died of a stroke 11 years earlier, leaving his son the mills, the debts, and a reputation he couldn't hold on to. Ryan turned out to be a hopeless manager, soft, indecisive, easily swayed, and time after time he made bad calls, took out loans against what property remained, sank money into failed ventures, all in a desperate attempt to prove to his father, already gone, that he was worthy of the Bell name. By the time he turned 40, all he had left was one run-down lumber mill drowning in debt, and a reputation as the man who'd lost his father's inheritance in a single generation. Carter and Partners, the investment fund that had grown out of a tiny furniture workshop, had become one of the largest players in manufacturing across the region. When the bankrupt Bell Mill came up for auction, the fund's analysts couldn't quite understand why their director, Ethan Carter, insisted on handling the deal personally, without his usual team of lawyers. "Ethan, it's a small operation, not a great deal. Why go out there yourself?" his CFO asked, looking over the plant's financial report. "Send a team, close it remotely." "I'm going myself," Ethan said shortly, not taking his eyes off the window. "It's personal." He didn't explain what personal meant. Nobody at the company knew the director's history. He never talked about his past, and the sparse records of his conviction had long since been expunged once his sentence ended, never once surfacing in his spotless business resume. He was driving to Cedar Falls for the first time in 20 years. Painfully familiar scenery slid past the car window. The same river, the same forest, only the town itself had shrunk, gone quieter, as if it had grown old right along with everyone still living there. He didn't know what this trip had in store for him. He thought he was going to close the final chapter of his past, sign the papers on the mill that had destroyed his family, and maybe, for the first time in 20 years, look the man who'd betrayed him in the eye. He had no idea he was about to find not just the end of an old story, but the beginning of an entirely new one whose existence he'd never even suspected. To understand why Ryan Bell had stayed silent for 20 years, only to decide to tell the whole truth in the span of 5 minutes, you have to go back 7 years, to the day his carefully constructed world first cracked. Sophie was 12. She was riding her bike home from music school when a car hit her at an intersection near the market. The driver hadn't seen her in the blinding evening sun. The girl was rushed to the hospital with a compound fracture and heavy blood loss. "The patient's blood type is B negative, a rare type," the doctor told the parents, who sat in the ICU hallway. "Our blood bank barely has any in stock. What's your blood type?" "O positive," Ryan answered quickly, already reaching for his phone to call in donors. "Mine's O positive too," Emma said quietly, going pale enough that Ryan feared for a moment she might faint right there. The doctor frowned, checking her notes. "I'm sorry, but that's genetically impossible. If both parents are type O, the child can't be type B." A ringing silence fell over the hallway. Ryan turned slowly to face his wife, not with anger, but with a kind of detached, almost resigned recognition, as if this thought had been living inside him for years, just waiting for a reason to surface. "Emma?" She broke down, clamping a hand over her mouth to keep from screaming right there in the hospital corridor in front of strangers. "I'm sorry, Ryan. I'm so sorry. I couldn't. I thought I'd take it to my grave." He didn't make a scene, not in that moment. Their daughter was fighting for her life one floor up, and nothing else in the world mattered besides her recovery. They found an emergency donor with the rare match, a nurse from another ward who saved Sophie's life without ever knowing what family drama she'd stumbled into. When the girl started to recover, Ryan and Emma talked through the whole night at the kitchen table. Honestly, for the first time in their entire marriage, holding nothing back. "It's Ethan," Emma said, not a question, a statement, staring at the table. "Sophie's father is Ethan." "I figured," Ryan said flatly. "Were you planning to keep this quiet forever?" "I didn't know what to do. Your father told me if the truth ever came out, he'd make sure Ethan rotted in prison forever, that he'd find a way to add years to his sentence. I was scared, and then it just got too late to change anything without blowing everything up." Ryan sat quietly for a long time, looking at the cold tea in his mug. "You know, the scariest part is, I'm not angry at you," he finally said. "I'm angry at myself for choosing 20-some years ago to steal someone else's happiness instead of trying to earn my own." That was the night, 7 years back, when the weight began building inside him. The weight he would finally carry into the director's office years later, the day Ethan Carter came back to Cedar Falls. He had no idea back then that he'd finally decide to tell the truth not out of some sudden burst of courage, but out of bankruptcy, a ruined life, and one last chance to fix something before he lost everything for good. The director's office at the mill, the very room where 20 years earlier Richard Bell had laughed in his father's face, had barely changed. The same dark wood paneling on the walls, the same heavy desk, just worn down by time now, and it seemed by money that had long since run out. Ryan Bell rose to greet his guest, a heavy-set, gray-haired man with bags under his eyes and hands that trembled with nerves. He didn't recognize at first the polished, self-assured businessman standing before him as the same boy from the workshop. "Ethan? Ethan Carter?" he breathed, going pale. You're Carter and partners?" "I am," Ethan said shortly, not offering his hand. "Let's sit. Let's talk terms." Ryan sank back into his chair like his legs had given out from under him. "Ethan, listen, I've wanted to tell you something for 20 years. We're not here to talk about the past," Ethan cut him off, laying a folder of documents on the desk. "We're here to decide the fate of a mill your father built on the bones of my family." Heavy silence settled over the office. Ryan looked at his old friend for a long time, then said, slowly, as if it cost him something, "You could just shut this place down, you know. Sell it off piece by piece, liquidate the equipment, lay off every worker with no severance, the way my father once did to yours. You have every right to do it. Everyone would call it justice." Ethan said nothing, studying the man across from him, broken, stripped of his old polish, crushed by his own mistakes more thoroughly than Ethan himself ever could have managed. "I thought about this for a long time," he finally said. "All these years I've played this conversation out in my head 1,000 times. In my imagination, that's exactly what I did. Tore down everything left of the Bell name, so you'd feel even a fraction of what we felt." "So why aren't you doing it?" "Because I don't want to become your father," Ethan said simply. "I'm keeping the mill. I'll invest, modernize the operation, keep the jobs. The people here didn't do anything wrong. They just want to feed their families, the same way my father once did." "And me?" Ethan gave him a long look. "You're going to work for me, as a shop floor foreman, No director's office, no big salary, no name that used to open every door in town. Let's see what you're worth without your father's name behind you. Ryan lowered his head. Tears rolled down his cheeks, for the first time in years, not out of self-pity, but out of the realization of just how fair that offer really was. "Thank you," he whispered. "That's more than I deserve." "I know," Ethan said dryly, rising from the desk. "But I'm tired of carrying hatred around. It ate up 20 years of my life. I don't want to give it one more day." He'd already started toward the door when Ryan called after him, his voice cracking, like he was gathering strength for something far heavier than a conversation about a lumber mill. "Ethan, wait. There's something you need to know. About Emma. About what happened while you were inside." Ethan froze at the door, a chill running down his spine. He had no idea yet that the next 5 minutes would turn everything he thought he knew about the last 20 years of his life upside down. "What is it you want to tell me?" Ethan asked quietly, turning around. Ryan was silent for a long moment, as if searching for the last scraps of his courage. "Emma and I got divorced 12 years ago," he began. "The marriage was never real. She married me because she didn't have a choice, and I knew that, and I married her anyway because I wanted to take something from you. Not just the girl, the very idea that you might have something I didn't. I know that already, Ryan. I don't need the details." "No, you don't know the important part," Ryan said, raising his eyes, full of pain. 7 months after the wedding, we had a daughter, Sophie. Everyone assumed she was born early, small, fragile. Only she didn't stay fragile for long. She grew up strong, healthy, the spitting image of her mother. Gray eyes, a will like iron. Ethan felt the air catch in his chest, but he didn't yet let himself finish the thought. 7 years ago, Sophie got hit by a car, on her bike. Ryan continued, his voice breaking. She needed an emergency blood transfusion. That's when we found out. She's type B negative. I'm O positive. Emma's O positive too. By the laws of genetics, that's simply not possible if I'm her father. The office went completely silent. Ethan stood frozen, afraid to move, as if any motion might shatter the fragility of the moment. That's when I understood everything, Ryan said quietly. I did the math. The last time you two were together before your arrest. The rushed wedding my father set up just 2 months after your trial, when these things usually take months to plan. Sophie is your daughter, Ethan. Not mine. Ethan's legs gave out, and he dropped into the chair by the door, feeling the ground fall away beneath him for the second time in his life, only this time in the opposite direction. Why didn't you tell me? All these years? Because I'm a coward, Ryan said, not breaking eye contact, telling the plain truth for the first time in his life. I loved her like she was my own daughter. I still do, even though Emma and I are divorced, and I only see Sophie on weekends. I was afraid that if the truth came out, I'd lose the one person who calls me Dad. It was selfish. It was low. But I couldn't make myself do it. Did Emma know? She's known from the beginning. She wanted to tell you right away, wanted to write to you in prison, but my father threatened that if she said a single word, he'd get you transferred to a maximum security facility. He had connections in the system. She stayed quiet to protect you, and then the years passed, and telling you only got more terrifying. Ethan sat with his head in his hands, trying to make sense of what he'd just heard. For 20 years, he'd believed he'd lost everything. His home, his father, his love, his youth. It turned out that somewhere in this very town, his daughter had been growing up the entire time, and he'd never known she existed. "Where is she now?" he asked hoarsely. "Where's Emma?" "Teaching at the same school we all went to. And Sophie." Ryan managed a weak smile through his tears. "Sophie's studying architecture. Says she wants to build houses with her own hands, not just draw them on paper. I don't know where she gets it. Golden hands and stubborn as hell, just like you were back in the day." Ethan found Emma in the schoolyard, sitting on a bench under an old maple tree, grading papers, and she didn't notice him right away. "Emma." She looked up, and the papers slipped from her hands. "Ethan," she whispered, rising to meet him, not quite believing her eyes. "You came back." "Ryan told me everything." Her face twisted with pain and relief at once. 20 years of silence finally finding a way out. "Forgive me," she sobbed, covering her face with her hands. "Forgive me for everything. For the letter, for the silence, for the years I stole from you with your own daughter. I wanted to tell you so many times, but every time I was afraid. For you, for her, for myself. I was weak." Ethan stepped forward slowly and carefully put his arms around her, for the first time in 20 years, as if afraid she might fall apart in his arms, the way everything else once had. "You weren't weak," he said quietly, close to her ear. "You were a girl backed into a corner, trying to protect yourself, and me, and our daughter, the only way you had left. I don't hold it against you. I've lived on hatred long enough. I don't want any more of it." She raised her tear-streaked eyes to him, full of timid, almost forgotten hope. "What now?" "Now," Ethan said, smiling for real for the first time in longer than he could remember. "I want to meet my daughter. And after that, we'll see. Seems like we've got 20 years to make up for." Sophie Bell didn't learn right away that the man who'd come to town for the mill was her real father. Her mother told her the truth that same evening at the kitchen table, her voice shaking, bracing herself for tears, anger, rejection. But Sophie, after hearing the whole thing, just took her mother's hand. "You know, Mom, I always felt like something was missing from the picture. I can't explain it, it's just... a lot of things make sense now." A week later, she went to the mill herself, to the place where her real grandfather, Robert Carter, whose name she'd only just heard for the first time, had once worked. Ethan met her at the shop floor gate, the very building he was restoring from the old man's original blueprints. "Hi," the girl said uncertainly, studying the tall, graying man with tired but kind eyes. "Mom said that you're my father." Ethan looked at her for a long time, at Emma's gray eyes, at the stubborn set of her shoulders that he'd have recognized anywhere, because he saw it every morning in the mirror. "Hi, Sophie," he said, his voice catching. "I don't know where to start on 20 years of conversation we never got to have. But if you'll let me, I'd like to teach you what my father knew how to do. Working wood with your hands, not just drawing it on paper." Sophie smiled, the exact same smile that had won over a young carpenter's heart 20 years ago on a summer evening by the river. "I'd like that. A lot." Ethan Carter lost almost everything he had as a young man. His father, his home, his freedom, his love. He'd believed the world's cruelty had burned out of him any capacity to believe in something good. But sometimes life doesn't take things away to destroy you. Sometimes it takes them so it can hand them back to you, much later, with interest, not as revenge, but as a daughter he never knew he loved until he saw her eyes. So much like the eyes of the woman he'd never stopped loving all those years. He'd come to Cedar Falls to close an old chapter of his life. Instead, he found the beginning of a new one. 6 months later, Cedar Falls celebrated the reopening of a newly renovated woodworking shop, the very one where little Ethan Carter had once held his first ever hand plane, and the very one where, decades later, his daughter Sophie came to work on her first thesis project. It was raining that day too, by strange coincidence. The same kind of rain that had fallen the day he came back. Only this time, Ethan wasn't standing alone under the awning by the gate. Beside him stood Emma, carefully, step by step, learning to trust him again. Sophie, chattering excitedly about her plans to restore the old factory building. And Chloe, who'd come for the opening with her family, and beside her stood Aunt Pam, the woman who had become a second mother to her, wiping away tears of pride. Ryan Bell, now just a foreman on floor 2, stood modestly off to the side, but Ethan waved him over to join the group. "Enough hiding in corners, Ryan. You're part of this story, whether you like it or not." Ryan nodded gratefully, and something in that simple human gesture finally erased the last traces of 20 years of hostility. Ethan pulled out the same old photograph from his pocket. Emma and himself, young, laughing, certain that only happiness lay ahead. He showed it to his daughter. "This is who we were, back when it all started." Sophie studied the photo for a long time, then smiled, exactly the way her mother once had, by the river. "You know, it really is starting all over again, just 20 years later." Ethan pulled them both into his arms, the woman he had never stopped loving, and the daughter whose existence he hadn't known about a year earlier, and thought about how strangely life arranges things. It takes everything away, only to hand you back, through pain, betrayal, and years of loneliness, far more than you ever dared to dream of. Rain drummed on the roof of the new shop, the same sound of rain that had haunted him for 20 years, a reminder of everything he'd lost. But now, for the first time in a long time, that sound didn't scare him. It sounded like a beginning. Dear friends, that brings us to the end of our story today. Ethan's story reminds us that life sometimes tests a person with real cruelty. You can lose your home, your trust, your love, years of your life. But even after the hardest trials, fate sometimes opens a door right where you'd already stopped expecting any light to come through. For 20 years, Ethan lived with the pain of his past. He thought he'd lost everything, for good. But it turns out the truth is often more complicated than it looks, and forgiveness sometimes takes more strength than revenge ever could. So here's my question for you today. Do you think you could forgive someone who once destroyed your life, if, years later, they came to you with genuine remorse? And do you believe that fate sometimes gives us back what we lost, even if it takes years to happen? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your words, your own experiences, your own story. They might be exactly what someone out there needs to hear if they're going through a hard time right now. If this story touched your heart, show it some love with a like. Subscribe to Real Life Stories Live so you don't miss the next story about love, betrayal, hope, and the strength of the human spirit. And check out our other stories. They should already be popping up on your screen. This story was narrated by Jason. Take care of yourselves and the people you love. Cherish the ones who are with you today, because sometimes the most important people in our lives are the ones fate gives back to us years down the road.